Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of AAC in the Cloud. Today we have with us Suzanne Martin, and she is from the ACE Center and will be presenting a session to us today about the development of an AAC assessment tool to help and support AAC practitioners. So we will turn things over to Suzanne. Thank you so much for being with us today, and we'll let you take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you. So, hi everybody, thanks for joining this session. Just to say, I'm Suzanne Martin. I'm a senior AAC consultant for ACE Center. So ACE Center in the UK is a charitable organisation, and we deliver a National Health Service contract for specialised AAC services. And we also provide advice and information services, as well as some training services as well. So we cover quite a few different things. I'll talk a little bit about some of what we do within today's session. So yes, I wanted to talk to you today about the development of an assessment tool that we did. So I shall just move on. So just wanted to put the assessment tool really in a little bit of context, give you a little bit of history as to the origins of it and why we decided to do what we did. So in January 2015, the National Health Service in England began to fund a service to provide high-tech AAC to children and adults who meet an eligibility criteria set by NHS England. So what NHS England created was a proposal of a hub and spoke model. So each geographical region had a specialist hub, which takes responsibility for the most complex AAC cases, while the local clinical commissioning groups, so we know them as CCGs in the UK, which are mainly managed by general practitioners, and they commission the vast majority of local AAC services, although some of them, the reality is that some of them also sit in education as well. So that sounds great, doesn't it? This great funding for AAC, that's what we're all looking for, and we were very hopeful and thankful to receive the funding for the hub services in 2015. Unfortunately, what happens in reality is that whilst the centralised funder, NHS England, funded those hubs within that hub and spoke model, the spokes weren't funded. So there wasn't a particular directorate to really specify that each CCG would fund a local AAC service. So what has happened is that it's kind of, in some regions you do have some local AAC services, and in some regions you don't. So that just gives you a little bit of background as to what's happening in the UK in terms of NHS AAC services. So in terms of the ACE Centre, we cover the light blue section up at the top of England there in the northwest, and we also cover the Thames Valley and Wessex region in yellow down at the bottom of England there. So between our two offices in Manchester and in Oxford, we cover about a fifth of the English population requiring AAC. So we've seen about 2,000 patients since the start of the contract in 2015. And so we cover quite a large proportion and see quite a range of different individuals. So as part of our NHS England contract, the service specification has specifically asked us to look at the support of establishing local AAC services. So when we think about the hub and spoke model, it's some of the hub's responsibility to help those local and emerging AAC services to really support their development, the training of staff, and the thinking about their pathways and access to equipment. And so when that was put into our service specification, we weren't told, there wasn't any blueprint about how we might do that really. So each hub has kind of perceived that in a different way and delivered that support in different ways. So what A Centre did was we wanted to really look at identifying local areas who were kind of ready to go really, and were thinking about the development of their service. And so we identified some local areas to support kind of the establishment of those services, and to meet that kind of 90% of people that required AAC that weren't eligible for the more specialised and complex services. So we created what's known as the LACES project in A Centre, so that's local AAC services. And we work with a number of local services, both in our North Office and our South. And one of the things that we really wanted to focus on was to really facilitate that shared learning with other local and specialised AAC services by creating a commissioning toolkit and also a local service toolkit. And the assessment tool that I'm talking about today is included in that local service toolkit. So it's hopefully another tool in that toolkit for AAC practitioners to use as part of their local service delivery. So one of the things that we discovered when we were working closely with those local services is that they sometimes experienced, and we experienced the same as well at the specialised service level, that there was some difficulties sometimes when people were making referrals about really accurately and richly describing what is happening with somebody's communication. What are they doing? How are they doing it? And with what are they doing it with? So on the screen here, you can see some examples around some of the things that we often see written into our referral forms. So for example, the child knows what she wants and she expresses her needs through facial expressions. So although that's accurate and that's true, it doesn't tell us an awful lot really about what that child is doing in terms of the range of different things that she might be doing. When it says she expresses her needs, what type of things is she expressing, and how are her communication partners perceiving those attempts? And is that a consistent interpretation across multiple communication partners? So lots of questions really, even though that's quite an accurate statement in terms of the referral form. The other thing that we often see is the description around keywords and the ability to follow keywords instructions, and also expressively. Often therapists might write he is working at a 3 keyword level, or can express at a 3 keyword level, but it doesn't give us a lot of information about what type of language at that 3 word level. What different scenarios and the different communication partners that is relevant to. Other kind of examples are around sometimes stating and naming the technology. So she uses Pod to communicate and has been working on Grid Player. So a lot of kind of statements around the technology, rather than a description of, so how does she use Pod to communicate, in what way, and what types of things does she communicate? And equally on Grid Player, what might be happening on that, and some examples of what might be expressed using that particular tool. So as you can see, there are a wide range of kind of statements that are made, and I think one of the challenges for services like ours, a selfish kind of interest, I suppose, is that the way in which we work is that we will go out and visit individuals within their own environments. So we will go to their home or their school or their college, their care home, their residential home. So it's really important for us to have really accurate referral information in order to even just know what to pack to take with us. And so often if it's quite vague, the information, and it's not very clear about the language being used and what type of methods are involved, sometimes we end up turning up with not the right stuff, really, and that's kind of frustrating for both of us and for the patient as well. So we have a vested interest, I suppose, in trying to improve the quality of how practitioners really go about describing what their clients are doing in a rich and really kind of good quality way. So we went about looking at assessment tools that would be useful in the toolkit. And one of the things that we wanted to look at was the Pragmatics profile of everyday communication skills in children. So you may have kind of come across this, you might be very familiar with it. It's very old now and has been used for a long time. So it was originally devised in 1988 by Hazel Jewett and Susie Summers, and kind of originated for use with preschool children. But then they revised that edition and extended it to school-aged children up to 10 years, which was published in 1995. It's been extensively used by speech and language therapists for many years. So I'm sure any speech language therapists, speech language pathologists will be very familiar with it probably. Not so much in the education sector, not from my experience in the UK. It's often a new tool for them. And so it was certainly familiar to me. So I came from a community clinic background. So started my career working with verbal children with phonology and language difficulties before I then started to specialise in AAC. And certainly in the community clinic environment, it was widely used, and I was quite familiar with that in relation to verbal children. So it's kind of based on a parent or caregiver interview schedule whereby you ask quite open-ended questions, and it's quite an informal interview of parents or caregivers, and you're able to kind of prompt and probe a little bit as a result of some of their answers, so that you can gain a real richness of data around what the individual is doing. So it's been freely available, the original profile, for many years, and it's available still to download now. Sometimes it kind of disappears on the internet, but it often pops up again. So it is worthwhile having a look at that. So we were very interested in this tool because we had found it really useful, not only from our kind of background, but also in relation to individuals using AAC. More so because it kind of really goes into a lot of detail about responses to communication and offers of expressive communication as well. So the original profile, it kind of, its main focus really was to think about supplementing those more conventional approaches to assessment that we might be more used to, so the more standardised assessment. And it wanted to look at trying to get that richness of data from children as communicators in everyday interactions, rather than within a snapshot within a clinic room or a session. So it really emphasised kind of how communication is achieved by that individual, how language is used to communicate a variety of intentions, a range of different communication functions, and how it relates the communication needs of the listener as well. So how might the listener respond, and how might the communicator respond to that listener? And also how children participate in kind of conversation and some of the higher level connected discourse as well. So it was of great interest to us to have a look at. Having said that, there were some downsides to the original profile. So obviously, as I'd already said, it was originally designed with verbal children in mind. And kind of due to the nature of the type of referrals that our service gets, we'd often find ourselves doing the preschool version with parents and carers of kind of teenagers and young adults, where the type of skills that we were looking at were kind of emergent language skills, quite early communication skills, even though their chronological age was much older. And that always felt a little bit uncomfortable, kind of, getting out paperwork with kind of preschool plastered all over it. When clearly it wasn't anything to do with their educational level. It was around what we really wanted to know about how and why they were communicating. And I think one of the other kind of downsides that we recognised was that because the original profile was kind of made with verbal children in mind, often the prompts and the examples that were suggested were often more appropriate for verbal children, and also really didn't take into account any physical disability or sensory impairment. So often the prompts might be, does the child kind of take you by the hand and walk you over to the thing that they want? And for some of our children, that wouldn't be possible for them to do. Other examples might be that they might look at an object and then look towards a listener or a communication partner. And for our clients with sensory impairment, that was really, really difficult to try and think of examples that would be appropriate to suggest as a probe or as a prompt to parents and caregivers to think about what's involved in that question. And it was often quite difficult to do that on the fly when we were working with the original profile. So what we wanted to have a think about is how can we make that easier. And I think even though I've been working in AAC for a number of years, I still find it quite difficult to do that on the fly, kind of changing. And I'm sure that would be quite challenging for new practitioners, newly qualified practitioners, or those people who are new to AAC. So we decided to take that original profile, and we contacted the publishers. We couldn't ever find the authors, so I believe that one has passed away and one doesn't seem to have any kind of contact details out there. So we contacted the publisher, NFER Nelson, and asked their permission to adapt the profile to make it more relevant for those people who are using AAC, that also kind of took into account potential sensory impairment and physical disability as well. So we were granted permission to revise the profile, as long as we didn't make any money out of it, basically, so that we provided it for free and we appropriately referenced the original profile, which we can do easily. So we looked at the original profile and then systematically kind of analysed it for relevance to what we needed it for. And we created 4 new sections or 4 revised sections. So establishing context and motivation, reasons to communicate and reactions to communication, some contextual variation, and then participation in conversation. So we kind of took each of those sections and looked at the relevant questions within those sections, and then we adapted each of the prompts and probes for each of those questions to make them more appropriate and more relevant. So an example might be that we might be asking about the function of requesting reoccurrence. So, for example, if you were listening to music with child's name and they wanted you to play the song again, how would he or she let you know? And then the prompts and probes might be that answers could include, but not limited to, by smiling, using a body movement, vocalizing, e.g. pleading sounds, requesting more, using the AAC resource, using their AAC resource to say more or again, or any other offer that is basically perceived by a communication partner to indicate that they are requesting more or again, or the reoccurrence of something. So that gives you a bit of a flavour of kind of the type of question and the type of prompts that are now included. So just in the same way that the original profile was administered, it's exactly the same. So you complete interview questions. It's kind of really encouraged that it be an informal conversation with parents and caregivers or school staff, nursery staff, college staff. And it might be that as part of your interview, you may go off on tangents and you might actually cover multiple questions in one kind of conversation. So you might end up kind of hopping around the profile a little bit. You don't have to complete the whole profile, so it's basically down to your clinical judgment as to how far you go. So often when interviewing individuals, it might be very apparent that we're talking about a child that's at a very emerging stage in their language development, and although we might start to think about more complex actions, we might not get up into some of the really kind of complex language things about how does the child indicate sarcasm and things like that. We would feel that it wouldn't be appropriate to go through those questions where they may not be using anything formal, no formal kind of AAC or formal methods at all. So you can just stop the profile where you think it's best to stop. So I'm just going to hop out and share my other screen just to show you a few items. So there is a summary chart at the beginning of the profile. So once you've completed the profile, we encourage you to fill out this kind of summary chart. And I'm hoping you can see on your screen that we have in each section the ability to mark off whether the individual does this. They may do this sometimes. So sometimes some communication partners may see it, or some environments might see it, whilst others do not. Whereas if all communication partners see it and all environments see it, it would be a clear they do this. So yeah, does this, may do this, does not do this at all. It might not be applicable, as discussed in terms of language level and language complexity. We might not be expecting that at that particular age or that particular stage of development. And then we also have a line for a potential target as well. So as you're going along, it might be that you think, okay, that individual has a very, very clear response. It's a very consistent response for, a few communication partners, but only in one environment. And then when you might administer the profile with another individual that knows the client in another environment, they don't really or aren't really aware that that client does have that expression to mean that particular function. And so it might be that might kind of trigger off in your head, this could be a potential target for us to work on. So it might be that at home, this person taps their leg to indicate that they want more of something, but only mum and dad and their siblings actually perceive that to mean that. and that maybe school haven't recognised that behaviour and attributed meaning to that. So that might be something that you might just flag up on that summary chart as a potential target of things to explore then with the team as a whole, and think about, you know, really, do we want to start looking at this as something that we want to try and make consistent across all communication partners and all environments, so that the feedback that individual is getting is more consistent. So as you go down the summary chart, you can see that each section is covered, so that you end up with a bit of a record, a summary of all the responses. So the other thing that I also wanted to show you is, hang on, there is also a appendix at the back of the profile that again is kind of a summary of all of the things that you've elicited from parents and caregivers and team members around that individual. And it might be that you might want to document all of that in the one place. So in Appendix 1, we've got the methods of communication chart. So as you can see here, we still have the same sections, just as in the summary chart, but here we have a way of kind of documenting what method of communication they're using, whether that be formal, so the use of an AAC resource, either at a single word level or a sentence or phrase level, or are they using informal or unaided methods, so eye pointing, body movement, vocalizations, signs, gestures, facial expressions, or anything else for that matter. And then there's these little prompts here to say FO, and that means understood by familiar communication partners only, or all, so understood by all or most people. So for example, a body movement to affirm something, so if they say yes with a head nod, then that would be pretty much understood by most people, even an unfamiliar partner. So you might not want to work on that in an AAC resource, because they've got a very intelligible way of communicating that. Whereas they may have some very specific ways of communicating very specific things that you've really discovered by administering the profile, that they might be understood by very familiar communication partners only. So maybe family members or a specific one-to-one worker, you know, teacher's aide, who knows the child really, really well. So it's a really good way of kind of documenting all of that and seeing, again, in terms of potential targets or objectives that you might want to work on, what might be some of the things that might be worth discussing as a team to move on to. So I shall just flick back to PowerPoint. Oh, bear with me. Okay, so I'm hoping you can see that okay. So we've looked at the summary chart and looked at the methods of communication chart. So I just wanted to give you an example of one of the clients that we've used the profile with. So this is a local service client who we have supported the local therapists with. So this was a very young boy, a 3-year-old, and his name's Matthew, and he had an antenatal cerebral infarction leading to a diagnosis of cerebral palsy, right hemiplegia, and he had quite a significant cortical visual impairment with a tendency to look preferentially to the right, and then he also experienced infantile spasms. So some of the initial kind of information that came about Matthew was that he was showing awareness of others through changes in his eye movement or head and body position. And he was beginning to show pre-intentional and effective communication. So this was kind of written into his report, speech therapy report. And obviously, yeah, the parents recognised that as a statement that was true and factual, but they didn't really know what to do with that, and they didn't know how to kind of move things on or support Matthew's ongoing development of communication. One of the recommendations that the local team had suggested was that adults were to model language at a single word level with use of objects of reference to support his understanding. And again, you know, those are sound recommendations. But the difficulty for Matthew, particularly with his cortical visual impairment, was the visual novelty of items, and also how to represent some of those early communication functions, really. So it was interesting to consider all of that, those kind of recommendations, and then what we found out after doing the profile. So I'll just whiz on. Looks slightly different, the profile in this slide, because it was an older version back in the day. We've updated it and made it a bit prettier since then. So Matthew, after we administered the profile, it became apparent that actually he was offering quite a lot of expressive communication. He was certainly showing signs of requesting recurrence at home with mum and dad, but nursery weren't picking up on that. He was definitely requesting cessation, so it was very clear when he wanted to stop things, and he was very expressive about that, using kind of body movements and gesture and grimacing facial expressions, and there were some other examples of him requesting actions and continuations of nursery rhymes and activities, like going on a swing and being bounced on mum's knee, for example. So we elicited lots of really kind of interesting information from doing the profile, and got a lot of in-depth information about the differences between certain environments, certain communication partners, and then some of the informal methods that Matthew was using. So we completed the profile and we did the summary, and there were some clear, you know, potential targets kind of coming out of that in terms of trying to make communication partners' responses to some of those behaviours a little bit more consistent, as well as trying to formalise some of those things that he was offering. And that couldn't be done just through the use of objects of reference. So we felt that there would be a benefit to trying to formalise his representation methods. So what we found was that we were, and the local therapists were, able to kind of better describe what he was really doing. So, for example, a new kind of phrase that we could use to describe. I've made a mistake on my slide. It says Eddie, and there's another boy that we were seeing. But this individual was called Matthew. So Matthew was able to request reoccurrence using a body movement, a movement of a clenched fist up and down and banged on the side of his leg. But this is only understood by familiar communication partners. Matthew is able to request cessation of an event or activity by body movement, so turning his head away, and he begins to cry. This communication is understood and interpreted by unfamiliar communication partners as an indication that Matthew wants to stop. So we can see by those descriptions that it's a lot richer than the initial kind of observations that were provided by the local therapy team. And just as a bit of information, really, our next steps for Matthew were to introduce a visual plus auditory scanning pod book that's presented with one high contrast symbol per page. I went to visit Matthew not so long before we went into lockdown, and he was doing really, really well with that, with a very clear yes response now, and there was lots of mapping of those symbols happening to everyday activities. So I think by kind of doing the profile and really identifying some very clear focuses for things to look at, his local team were able to really better pinpoint what they'd like him to be achieving, and also how we might do that, how we might support that, with which resource. So just to conclude that the impact of the profile, we know from our stats, from our website stats, that it's been downloaded over 2,000 times, and that's great. Anybody can download the profile for free, so just go to our website, acentre.org.uk, and look under the resources section, and you can download it and have a look at it yourself. We welcome feedback of any kind. If there are any improvements that you feel should be made, then do please let us know. What we have found for both our own service at the specialised level, but also from our local service feedback as well, is that it has, where referrers have been encouraged to complete profiles, it has improved the quality of that referral information, which is what we wanted it to achieve, really. I think from our point of view, what we'd really like to do is provide more training around the Pragmatics profile for people who use AAC, and particularly in relation to, okay, now you've done one, so now what? Where do we go from there? So bridging the results from the profile into setting targets and how to deliver those targets more successfully. And I think the downside, I suppose, is that we don't have a way of kind of measuring the impact of a profile necessarily. And that's been something that we're always thinking about, and we continue to think about, really, about how we measure the impact of what that profile does for local teams and for services, for AAC practitioners. The biggest downside is that, unfortunately, it isn't all singing and all dancing. It is only one tool for one job. It still requires a certain amount of clinical judgment. It still requires you to take an answer that's being given and start to really ask some in-depth questions about that, and how you may then interpret those answers and responses. And I think that's still quite a skill that you tend to develop over time with doing the profile, but then also, as I say, kind of bridging the results of the profile over into credible targets, and then delivering those targets and seeing how successful they are. So I think that's me done. So obviously I'm not live, so I can't take any questions, but if you do have any questions or want some further information, then please do get in touch. That's my email there, smartin@acentre.org.uk. For those that are in the UK, we have a free helpline number, so the number's there on the screen, and anybody in or outside of the UK that has any inquiry, then our inquiries email is. We have lots of other resources, not just the Pragmatics profile for AAC. We have other resources, other publications and training packages on our website. So feel free to have a browse over that, and also follow us on social media. Our handles are at the bottom of the screen there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Suzanne. That was wonderful. I appreciate you sharing these resources that are really a useful option for kind of anybody that's looking to expand their abilities and have some things to just support their communicators and their different kiddos. So thank you for sharing that with us. Everyone, feel free
You're welcome.
to visit those websites. These are actually websites that I've used on several occasions to try and help and shared some resources with people, so I can vouch for them personally that there's some good information there, and it's great to have it available for free. So Suzanne, thank you so much, and we will get this up as part of AAC in the Cloud. And thank you for being here. Everyone, thank you for sharing this time with us in AAC in the Cloud, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session you review. Thank you.